Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that is absolutely no problem. My honourable colleague did have a fantastic speech just prior to question period, and I believe that her time wrapped up with the beginning of question period. Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, I should say, we once again find ourselves debating one of those issues that should cause each and every member of Parliament to take pause. Literally issues of life and death. We're debating medical assistance in dying. And Madam Speaker, I've had the opportunity to enter into discussion now a number of times on this subject, and I'm pleased to be able to do so again on the amendment that my colleague made to the report back from the Senate and some of the changes, what I would suggest are troubling changes that came out of the deliberations that took place in the other place. Before jumping into this, however, I would like to discuss some context into as every time I discuss this issue. It was early on in the last campaign, actually, I wasn't even yet elected, when door knocking in a community in my constituency, where I happened to knock on the door of a physician. And ironically, that individual, this of course was pre-COVID times. It's hard to believe, we're now a year into the pandemic, and it seems like the sort of campaigning we did in 2019 seems such a long time ago. But this physician, nobody actually answered the door. So I went to, was walking back down the path down the driveway to the front yard, and somebody called out from the backyard. So I went to the fence, and sure enough, ended up having a lengthy conversation. And what I find very, very interesting is this particular physician who has articulated some of the concerns regarding this and other issues that he faces in the medical profession as a medical doctor in a small rural community in Alberta. He actually outlined some of the concerns regarding medical assistance in dying. Now, I won't deny that I have positions on this issue that I've developed over my time in both politics and studying this and many other issues. But what was very, very interesting as I reflect back on these comments is this physician outlined a whole series of concerns, and we spoke for, they say in politics you shouldn't spend more than a couple minutes at the door. But I wanted to give this gentleman the time to outline his concerns. And he outlined to me, ironically, some of the concerns that we are debating today, with a suggestion about the slippery slope argument. I followed closely some of the debates that took place in the last Parliament, and issues around the initial court cases that have led us to first this Parliament being tasked with creating a framework in the last Parliament, and then some of the continuation of that. What I find very interesting is how accurately this doctor predicted some of the significant challenges that we're facing. And what he outlined as a very vocal, and this is me paraphrasing this conversation from a number of years ago now, very activist, vocal causes that are skewing the national conversation on ensuring that those who need protection most in our society are protected. And here we are today. I had the honor of being elected and have a seat in this amazing chamber, the place of democratic discourse in our country. And here we are, and I look at both the contents of what came back from the Senate and the various discussions that have been had regarding C-7 over the last number of months, and it is very, very troubling that I see that this gentleman, almost prophetic in the way that he talked about these issues, and some of the people groups that are being a framework that could lead to direct discrimination, and how some of these voices are being ignored. And I find it very, very interesting. In fact, I had the opportunity earlier today, Madam Speaker, to ask the Minister of Justice in his opening remarks, a question about consultations. And I was troubled by his response because it was, although passionate, I grant him that passion. We all are all passionate about various issues, especially of such a personal nature as this. But he went on to talk about how we need to address the suffering, but failed to truly answer the substance of why the government didn't go down the path of appealing this decision to a higher court, which would have allowed for greater certainty, certainly, on the type of legislation that would be enacted, and ensuring that it could be done in a way so that we don't find ourselves here again in maybe a number of years, maybe longer, maybe a little bit shorter than that. And I think it's troubling that it seems to be, again, in the words of this physician back during my first campaign running for office, about a year and a half ago, and speaking in that driveway, that the very vocal activist causes are getting a disproportionate amount of the airtime. And I bring that up, Madam Speaker, because we've seen an evolution of what's taken place both in this debate from what was discussed back in the last Parliament and some of the very valid concerns that some of my current colleagues and former colleagues who have either retired or as somebody who I count as a friend. I actually sat on his board while going to university, the late Mark Warwa. The passion that life was defended from within this place by individuals like that. And to where we see ourselves today. And Madam Speaker, that is the definition of a slippery slope. And it is incredibly concerning to me. And it is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that we take seriously our obligation to debate, discuss, and try to come out with the best outcome possible to serve, to protect, and ensure that Canadians are not placed in a position that they should not be in. And this issue probably would be in, for sure, the top 5, maybe even the top 3 of the issues that I hear about. And I will say openly to this House, I hear feedback on every side of this debate. Every side of this debate. And that's good. That's called democracy. That's called discourse. And that's exactly what the point is. That's why, we are, of course, organized into parties and represent different regions of the country, and each of us brings a different level of expertise. And I joke often, Madam Speaker, that the only job description required for a member of Parliament, the only job description is, or job requirement rather, the only job requirement for a member of Parliament is that you happen to get more votes than the other guy. And it's incredible that the strength of our democracy is in the diversity that results from that. And it's that diversity of opinions that forces us to take pause and debate these very, very important issues. And to go back now to the consultations that the minister undertook regarding this issue back in the early sitting weeks of the Parliament before prorogation. And I spoke to many constituents, was CC'd on emails, was sent emails directly. And in fact, I found it very, very troubling, Madam Speaker, that I heard from a number of constituents that the so-called consultations were being conducted in a way that would end in the objective of those who wrote the consultation piece. And Madam Speaker, that's the antithesis of what we try to do here. And in some cases, I had individuals with passionate perspectives on this subject that felt that they could not even participate in the consultations because of the way that they were formatted, laid out, and whatnot. And I find that's a troubling start to this process. And then we see the Minister of Justice's comments and in addition to others in the government about this as we've gone through this process, and it was debated after prorogation, which of course slowed everything down. We lost what is suggested about 35 sitting days. So whenever the government says, well, Conservatives just ought to hurry up, they're delaying the process. Well, prorogation, 35 days lost in terms of the legislative ability of this place to do its job. It's not just the 2 days that members opposite like to suggest, but 35 sitting days. And certainly the context for that certainly deflates any argument that the other side would suggest on this, and to suggest that we should simply rush something like this. And the context, I'd mentioned the ability to appeal this to a higher court. In fact, when discussing this matter with one of my colleagues, it seemed like they weren't even aware that it could have been appealed to a higher court, among some other notable instances where there's a troubling lack of information. But, Madam Speaker, we see an evolution that's taken place from when the minister first stood up, when questions first started being asked last fall, and said, we found the consensus. We found the consensus. And making clear declarations, definitive declarations, saying we consulted and we've listened to the consultations and we did our job, and those were the sorts of words that were being said from the government and the minister. As questions got asked, as committee discussions went on, as both in the House of Commons, in the committee here, and then the pre-study and study of the bill and debate of the bill in the other place, we saw that the language that the government used actually changed quite a bit. And an acknowledgement that there were a diversity of opinions. And what I suggest, would suggest, Madam Speaker, is that a lot of the diversity of these opinions was not respected in the beginning, but when there was a groundswell of concern. And there was a groundswell. My office received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands, of pieces of correspondence on this issue, showing concern. And what's interesting, Madam Speaker, there's very few issues that garner cross-partisan, multi-partisan, bipartisan, however one wants to define it. But this was one of those issues. In fact, people that would call and tell me, I didn't vote for you, but I'm concerned with the direction that the government is going. When I heard from Indigenous peoples saying this goes against the very fundamentals of our worldview, hear from disability advocates that are deeply concerned about a ableist type mentality within this country that has very, very troubling, could have very, very troubling consequences. Madam Speaker, we have the utmost responsibility to take these things very, very seriously. Now, Madam Speaker, there is of course to be acknowledged in the midst of this debate. This hits home very, very personally for a lot of us. And I know there's been some emotion expressed in that regard. And that's part of what an issue that's as important as this. And as Conservatives, we have a free vote on this issue. And you see a diversity of opinions within our caucus here, and that's great. That's democracy. And there's other parties. I don't exactly know where they stand on this. But certainly the autonomy of the member of Parliament is a constitutionally enabled thing here, which I think is often forgotten about. Certainly forgotten about by our media and the education of our parliamentary system. And I would emphasize to all those listening here and on Zoom that the autonomy of the member of Parliament is one of the keystones of our democratic system, which needs to be respected. But that's a little bit of a segue from what I wanted to get here. This is an incredibly personal issue. Everybody has had experience. I too have sat with loved ones during some of their last breaths, have seen the consequences and understand why this can be so emotional. But Madam Speaker, when I look at this in terms of the context of what we're debating today and the amendment that's been proposed on the government's response to the Senate changes, important steps that are taken to ensure that those most vulnerable among us are protected. And my colleague from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes, I believe, is the constituency. I certainly don't have the memory of the constituencies like the Speaker does, but it strikes at a attempt, a good faith attempt by Conservatives to try and move that dial on what is a host of what many have pointed out as problematic aspects of what took place in the other place. And certainly I watched with interest and commend, actually, let me take a brief moment to commend some of my Conservative colleagues in the other place. And having spoken with them about their process and in some cases their great disappointment and utter surprise at what they hoped to accomplish going into those deliberations with what resulted. So I do commend those Conservatives that sat around that table, and of which, Madam Speaker, I will note, have some of the most personal connections to this issue that impacts, that when hearing those stories, it certainly strikes right at our heart. We are now tasked with having to come to a place where we develop a framework. Now, the government likely has support to get this bill passed. But we've introduced an amendment to the government's response in order to try and address some of the challenges that we have heard. And this is not about some ideological parade to try and just make our points known, Madam Speaker. No, this is about trying to address some of the challenges that we have with this particular bill and specifically the response. So when we introduce these amendments, it's important for debate in this place to be able to acknowledge that as the ability to improve upon a piece of legislation, the ability to address aspects, to try and make something, even though there's deeply problematic aspects of it, and I would refer all of those, and I'm sure there's many watching, that to refer to some of my earlier speeches on the matter, but to try in good faith to add a level of protection to the most vulnerable within our society. To ensure that we are not creating a situation where a medical assistance in dying regime ends up giving people pushing people to the point of a decision that there is no coming back from. Trying to take some small steps to help move this bill in a direction that at least addresses some of these very, very serious concerns. And Madam Speaker, that's the attempt of what we're trying to do here today. And specifically, I would just mention, as I believe I have a couple of minutes left, the irony that we find ourselves in. You know, this House unanimously supported a 988 motion that would bring about suicide prevention, which is absolutely the right thing to do. I'm proud to support that. But here we are with a bill that many have suggested, and this is not just an ideological thing, many have suggested this bill moves the medical assistance in dying, assisted suicide, euthanasia, however it's defined, and just because it's defined differently in a way that some may not agree with, moves it in a direction that many, including myself, suggest is very, very concerning. Things need to be addressed, and that irony between supporting suicide prevention and a regime that may unintentionally, I certainly hope unintentionally, would result in what could be catastrophic things for our country. The need for palliative care. And certainly, I mentioned the late Mark Warwa and how he was literally, in fact, when it comes to an example of somebody living out their faith, Madam Speaker, he announced his retirement, that he wasn't going to run in the next election, was going to become a chaplain to help people through the end of their life. And he ended up being diagnosed with a very fast-moving cancer. And he ended up living out the very example of why palliative care is so important in this country. And then, in conclusion, we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic where disproportionately those affected are seniors and those most at risk. Yet here we are debating something where we need to ensure there are safeguards in place, because that tragic irony is certainly not something that I think anybody here would like the legacy to be. That while discussing and debating COVID supports and response, that we would also enable something that could be abused that would result in the end of life for vulnerable Canadians. So thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I look forward to some of the questions from my colleagues.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And, this is an issue that has been debated quite extensively. The former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, was unable to deal with the issue, even though there was a Supreme Court of Canada decision, which ultimately led to the bill being introduced and the debates and standing committees began back in beginning of 2016. There have literally been hundreds and thousands of hours of all sorts of consultations, debates, committees, and so forth. I wonder if the member feels at any point in time, does he think that it's time to move on?
The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and appreciate the question. And we are doing exactly, Madam Speaker, what all of us were elected to do: debate thoroughly and ensure that issues. And might I suggest, and I hope the member listened to the beginning of my speech, because I emphasize this, and certainly I believe I made an inference to one of the questions that he asked the last time I debated this subject. When it comes to issues of life and death like this, where there's a diversity of opinions and no clear consensus, like the government, like the minister at times has suggested that they found it. Well, Madam Speaker, the fact that there are those of us within this chamber that are attempting to, in good faith, address some of the challenges that we hear about from Canadians, from Indigenous peoples, from disability groups, that deserves debate in this place, and certainly we're going to continue to ensure that those voices are heard within this place, Madam Speaker.
The
Honourable Member from Montcalm. Questions and comments.
The
Honourable Member from Montcalm.
The
Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker, rather. There's an idea of a joint committee presented in these proposed changes. The Conservative member brought forward a great deal of elements to consider when it comes to the importance of the process of reflection. What does he think of the importance of this joint committee to improve care and to help those who are suffering?
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks for the question. And I think that it's unfortunate, and I outlined the problematic precursor to some of the areas of debate that we find ourselves, the situation that we find ourselves in today. And certainly the need for this to be debated and studied and wholesomely discussed, and consultation that doesn't direct a specific outcome, that's key. These are all things that are vitally important. And it's unfortunate that there, and a bit of an irony, I guess, that there would be a suggestion of a new committee to address what I would suggest is a very problematic aspect of this bill regarding mental illness. That there would be a desire to see that be addressed in the future, when the very basis of what we are, the place we are at today, has quite problematic origins. And I think that certainly debate needs to take place, and that's what we need to continue to do in this place.
Comments? The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague from Battle River Crowfoot for his in-depth speech and articulating many different concerns that he has. And one thing we've heard about is the challenges created by the current medical assistance in dying legislation is the requirement for final consent at the time the assistance is rendered. And we know that this forces those that are already assessed and approved for medical assistance in dying to make a cruel choice, often when faced with the possible loss of competence that would make them unable to give consent. They're either forced to go early or risk not being able to receive the assistance they need to avoid continuing to live with intolerable suffering. I think about Julie Breeze from my riding, who's brought to the attention concerns around her husband Wayne, who's challenged with Alzheimer's, and in that camp that they're making that difficult decision of whether to go early. And we know Audrey Parker campaigned to make Canadians aware of this problem, and that C-7 would fix that by craving a waiver of consent. Does my colleague agree, and do the Conservatives support Audrey's amendment and helping those facing end of life avoiding this cruel choice?
Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I would just point out or remind the member, and I did mention this in my speech, that this is a free vote for Conservatives. And certainly that's something, the autonomy of the Member of Parliament is key to our democratic system. So certainly I'm speaking on behalf of myself and certainly the perspectives of many of my constituents, although I said there is a diversity of opinions on the matter. And it's exactly the issue that he's brought up, is why this debate and the desire for, I think, all parties in good faith. I won't presuppose that anybody would enter this conversation without coming to it in good faith. At least I certainly hope not. That we have an honest and transparent and wholesome discussion about whether it's safeguards, the issues that got us to this point, why this decision wasn't appealed, why there wasn't an opinion of the Supreme Court sought to ensure that this legislation wouldn't come back to us again if challenges, a whole myriad of concerns surrounding us ensuring that we do our due diligence, and that's why we need to continue to do that in every way possible.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for York and Melville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd just like to mention Dr. Sanu Gained is a co-director, Division of Adult Psychiatry and Health Systems Division, and Associate Professor, Department of Psychiatry, where he's been a member of the University of Toronto faculty since 1999. And during a consultation with medical professionals, which I attended this past weekend, he indicated that the number of elderly requesting MAID since COVID restrictions have caused isolation and growing depression has grown from 1,200 to 21,000. Doesn't this illustrate the exact concern for the member in regards to C-7 being brought forward to this House during such a challenging time for all Canadians, but especially our most vulnerable?
For Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And let me start by thanking that honourable member for a lot of the work that she's done surrounding this, and I know other colleagues as well, to try and bring light to some of these serious things. That's why I talked about the irony. We're talking about what has been spent collectively between different levels of government in this country. More than $1 trillion on COVID response. We're talking here about enabling a regime that may not put safeguards in place effectively to protect the most vulnerable among us. And I think that's a national, that is setting us up. And I would hope that every person in this place takes seriously, that's setting us up for a national tragedy. We need to ensure that those among us, whether it's the elderly, whether it's Indigenous peoples, whether it's the most at risk within our society, whether it's those who are disabled, that we are putting in place the measures to ensure that those vulnerable among us are protected. That's certainly something I take very, very seriously.
Questions and comments? The honourable member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. I'd like to ask him whether he thinks that we should be doing more for people that are in crisis in terms of things like mental health, and would he support a national mental health strategy to bring mental health services fully into the Canada Health Act, and to ensure that anybody who needs counselling services could get those counselling services without having to pay out of pocket for them? Does he see a need for greater support for mental health services in this country?
I remember for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I think the member touches upon an important point, and that's the full spectrum of what healthcare is today. You talk or read, and I happen to have an affinity for going through really old newspapers. I think it's interesting to look back and see quite frankly how often history repeats itself. But when you look back to what medicine was in the prior to the introduction of the Canada Health Act or its evolution since, healthcare has changed dramatically. And I think that it's important to ensure that that's part of the debate surrounding this conversation. And certainly why that somebody's worst day should not be their last day. and I know that there's been some other members that have articulated very well some of the issues surrounding that, but to ensure that there's the supports, the ability to get treatment, counseling, whatever the wide spectrum of that looks like, and each individual will be different, each circumstance will be different, but to ensure that there is the supports necessary so that folks can get support so that they are not forced, and this is key, Madam Speaker, that they are not forced to consider something that is no more final than the end of their life.